Hi, and welcome to this tutorial in which I will talk you through some EQ decisions in a real-life mixing situation. I'm going to start with two of the most important elements, the bass part that underpins the whole song, and the kick drum that needs to fit with it. Both of these have a lot of low-frequency content, which is potentially problematic due to a psychoacoustic effect known as frequency masking. What this basically means is that loud sounds block out quieter sounds at the same frequencies. So if I allow the bass guitar to completely dominate the bottom couple of octaves of the mix, there will be no room for the low thump of the kick drum. I'm therefore going to shape both parts with EQ to help them fit together better. Let's start with the kick drum. Click the line to create an EQ band, and sweep a boost around the low frequencies. I'm going to narrow the Q a little so I can focus in on specific frequencies more accurately, sort of like an audio microscope. A well-tuned acoustic bass drum will often have a clear fundamental frequency somewhere around the 50 Hz region. In this case, the sound has been constructed by layering samples, so there isn't a single obvious fundamental. I'm finding the 40 to 50 Hz region a little too slow and boomy, however, so I'll try a bit higher. And I think around 65 Hz gives me a tighter kind of thump which better suits the song. So I'll dial the boost down to a less extreme setting and switch to the bass EQ. Let's have a healthy cut at the same frequency, 65 Hz, and turn up the Q to create a narrow notch. I'm going to sweep a boost around the low-mid frequencies next, as this region can often be more important to the bass sound than the really low subs. In this case, I'm finding some important harmonics at around 170 Hz. I'm not sure I really want to boost this frequency, however, as a build-up of energy in this area can make a mix sound muddy or boxy. So I'm going to leave the band in place as a marker, but disable it for now. Switch back to the kick EQ, and carve out a notch at that frequency instead. I'll add another band for the kick now. Clicking over to the left of the graph automatically creates a low shelving filter. And I'm going to use this to reduce the low boomy part of the sound that I don't like so much, and leave more room for the subby part of the bass guitar. Let's turn up the Q a little to create a steeper slope. Okay, sticking with the most important elements of the mix, let's bring up the lead vocal. I'll start by clicking to add a band, but this time I'm going to click the shape button and switch it to a low cut filter, otherwise known as a high pass. It's common practice to high-pass filter everything except bass instruments, as this removes low-frequency rubbish that you may not even be aware of. The usual method is to increase the filter frequency gradually until you start to hear it work, and then back it off a little. I'm aware that the microphone I chose for the session is perhaps a little on the bright side for this particular voice. The most obvious way to warm up a sound is with a boost to the low-mid frequencies. But EQ cuts usually sound more transparent than boosts, especially on an exposed lead vocal part like this. So I'm going to turn on the analyzer to help me identify which frequencies to remove. Now I can see a build-up of energy around 3 kHz. This region tends to sound harsh and abrasive when too prominent, as we can hear very clearly if I boost it. So I'm going to cut it out instead. But I'm going to make a mental note of this setting, and I may make adjustments as I add other elements of the mix, especially mid-range parts such as guitars. I can also see another build-up of energy around 10 kHz, especially on sibilant S sounds. So I'm going to put in another little notch, and then click and drag to select both bands, and narrow the Q a little for them both. There is another vocal part in the mix, more of a second lead than a backing part. Louisa's voice sounds very different to Nellie's, so I don't need to worry too much about separating them in the mix. But if I turn on the analyzer again, we can see the powerful low fundamentals of each note she sings, and I'm concerned that these may be a little overwhelming. I'll drag a low shelving filter over from the left and tame these slightly, and turn up the Q a little for a steeper slope. Again, this is a setting that I am quite likely to revisit once the mix is more complete. I'm going to dial in the usual high-pass filter as well to remove the low-frequency rubbish. Okay, let's bring in some guitars. This EQ is inserted on a stereo subgroup of all distorted rhythm guitar parts. I'm going to start with the usual low cut filter, but this time I'm going to set a high Q to create a resonant peak and sweep that peak around the low frequencies to find the low meaty part of the guitar sound. Now I can use the Q setting to shape the low frequency content. I'm going to go with a setting just above 1 to create a very slight resonant bump at that frequency. But then I'm going to switch back to the bass EQ again and try a little complementary notch at the same frequency to give the guitars a bit more room. While we're here, remember the 170 Hz region that we identified as important to the bass part. I'm going to switch back to the guitar's EQ again and dip that a bit at 170 Hz to give the bass part more room. Now notice the channel mode switch at the bottom. This defaults to left-right mode, which means the stereo placement buttons for that band can be left, right or linked. If I switch this band to left, I am now cutting 170 from only the left channel. Now notice what happens if I switch the channel mode to mid-side. The stereo placement buttons are now labelled M and S instead of L and R, and my 170 Hz cut is now being applied only to the middle of the stereo image where the bass guitar is panned. I'm going to go a step further with this and add a corresponding boost in the side channel. I'll be quite extreme to start with so we can clearly hear the effect it has. Essentially, I am dramatically widening the stereo image at just that frequency. Let's dial it back to a more sensible level. Now I haven't really changed the overall level of that frequency. I've merely shifted the energy away from the middle of the stereo image and out towards the sides. Very high frequencies are usually unnecessary or undesirable for guitar sounds. So I'm going to add another band, make sure it's stereo linked to affect both channels, and this time choose a high cut filter, otherwise known as a low pass. I'll take the same approach as I used for the low cut filter and wind in a healthy amount of resonance using the Q knob, then sweep it around the upper mid-range and lower treble region to identify the highest useful frequencies. In this case I think around 8 kHz. Now I can adjust the Q to control the crispness of the guitar sound. Let's turn on the analyzer and look for other possible issues. Immediately we see a couple of peaks in the upper mid-range region. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but in this case I'm concerned that the lead vocal part might get a little buried. So I'll put in a couple of slight cuts and dial those frequencies back a little. But seeing as the vocal is panned centrally, I might try selecting both those bands and switching them to just the mid channel, so we leave the stereo side component unaffected. The analyzer is also showing a bit of a dip around 1 kHz. This is often an important frequency for overdriven guitars, so I'm going to try a bit of a boost to see if I can open up the mid-range and make the guitars sound a little bigger. Finally, let's have another Pro Q over the whole mix for some overall processing. Overall mix EQ usually needs to be quite subtle, so the first thing I'll do is switch the graph scale to 6 dB so I can see what I'm doing better. I'll also switch the processing mode from the default 0 latency setting and choose the medium linear phase mode instead. Now I can fine-tune the whole mix. A slight cut at around 3 kHz, for example, is equivalent to cutting that frequency from every individual track, and will give the mix a smoother, softer sound. Of course, it may be better to leave these overall mix EQ decisions to a separate mastering stage, as you may change your mind when you hear the mix in context with the rest of the album. That's all I have time for in this video. Thanks for watching.
Ignorance is bliss.